When my husband, David, told me he wished he'd chosen someone else, I didn't say a word. Not because I agreed. Not because I was numb. But because, after 37 years of marriage, I finally understood silence could say what words never could. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that feels tired before it even begins. The light outside was thin, weak. The kind that can't decide whether to shine or disappear. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his glasses perched on the end of his nose, staring into a cup of coffee gone cold. I was folding laundry. The same laundry I'd been folding for nearly 4 decades. His shirts, his socks, his life. He said it casually, almost like mentioning the weather. I sometimes think I made a mistake, Mary. Maybe I should have married someone else. I remember the sound of the washing machine still spinning in the background. The hum of it almost swallowed his words, but not quite. I wish it had. For a moment I stood there, holding one of his old shirts, the blue one he wore to our daughter's graduation, and I felt the fabric tremble in my hands. But it wasn't the shirt trembling. It was me. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask who. At our age, you learn that some truths don't need to be spoken, they just sit there between you like an unwanted guest who refuses to leave. What hurt wasn't the sentence. It was how lightly he said it. Like our life, the house we built, the children we raised, the nights I stayed awake while he worked double shifts, all of it could be reduced to a passing regret. That night, while he watched television in the living room, I sat by the window, staring at the backyard we used to tend together. I remembered when we planted the rose bush by the fence. He said roses reminded him of me, beautiful, but with a bit of sting. I wondered when the sting had turned into a wound. The days that followed were heavy, like the air before a storm. He acted as if nothing had happened. He'd ask what was for dinner. He'd nod when I spoke. He'd even kiss my cheek before bed. But each touch felt like a signature on a contract that had already expired. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't angry. I was empty. And emptiness, I've learned, is far more dangerous than anger. I started remembering little things I had long buried. The first time he forgot my birthday because he was too busy. The time I sat alone in the hospital waiting room after my surgery because he couldn't get away from work. The nights he turned his back when I cried quietly into the pillow. They say love is built on forgiveness. But what they don't say is that too much forgiveness can build a cage. I began to wonder, had I loved him or had I simply survived him? One morning, while dusting the mantel, I found the photo from our wedding day. His hair dark, mine in curls, both of us smiling like we knew what forever meant. I stared at that picture for a long time. Then, without really deciding to, I turned it face down. That same day, I started writing again. It had been years since I'd picked up a pen just for myself. I opened an old notebook, the one I used to keep tucked in the kitchen drawer, and I wrote the date. Then I began, "Dear David, if you ever find this." I didn't know what the letter would become, only that I needed to start. Writing felt like breathing again, quiet, steady mine. Every night after he fell asleep, I'd sit by the lamp and write. Some nights were just a few lines. Other nights, pages. I didn't write with anger. I wrote with truth, the kind that takes decades to learn how to say. And while I wrote, I began to see the woman I used to be, the one who laughed too loudly, who dreamed of seeing the world, who wanted more than recipes and routines. Somewhere along the years, I'd traded her in for peace. But peace built on silence is no peace at all. Till I didn't confront him. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't about another woman or even about regret. It was about him facing himself, the man he'd become, the years he couldn't rewrite. And maybe I reminded him too much of the choices he wished he hadn't made. But I also knew something he didn't. The woman he thought he'd grown tired of was no longer waiting to be chosen. And as the weeks passed, I began to prepare, quietly, carefully, for the day I would leave. He didn't notice the small changes. How I started donating clothes, cleaning out drawers, sorting old papers. He thought it was just me keeping busy. He never imagined I was preparing a goodbye. But that's the thing about women like me, the ones who've spent a lifetime holding everyone else together. When we finally let go, we do it without a sound. And that's when I realized something that made my hands stop trembling. He may regret marrying me, but one day he'd regret losing me more. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the porch light flicker over the garden I had planted myself, the same garden where we had buried our time capsule the year we moved in. He had written "Forever my Ruth" on a small slip of paper inside it. Now, after 37 years, those words felt like a cruel joke. It's strange, isn't it? How love can die without a sound. There's no explosion, no fire, no thunder. Just silence, heavy, unbearable silence between two people who once finished each other's sentences. The next morning, Robert made coffee like he always did. He didn't say a word about what he'd confessed the night before. He hummed softly, as if the air wasn't thick with everything unspoken. I wanted to ask him why. Why now? Why after everything? But the words just wouldn't leave my throat. I set his breakfast on the table. The same blue china plates we got on our wedding day. The edges were chipped now, like us. He smiled weakly, said, "You don't have to cook for me today, Ruth." I smiled back, pretending not to hear the weight behind it, the distance that had quietly built between us. For the next few days, life went on as if nothing had happened. He went to work. I cleaned the house, baked bread, folded his shirts. And every time I looked at him, I saw a man I didn't recognize anymore. A stranger who once held my hand through childbirth. A stranger who had whispered promises under candlelight. Sometimes I caught him staring out the window, lost in thought. Once I asked what he was thinking about. He said, "Just wondering what life might have been if I'd made different choices." That was the moment I realized he wasn't thinking about us anymore. He was imagining a version of his life without me in it. That night, I cried quietly into my pillow. Not because I'd lost him, but because I finally accepted that I already had. It's a kind of grief no one talks about, losing someone who's still alive, still breathing next to you. He still said good night, still poured my coffee, still mowed the lawn on Saturdays. But his eyes, they were somewhere else. With someone else, maybe. Or just in a place where I no longer existed. A week later, our son Michael called. He said he was coming to visit, bringing his wife and the kids. I forced a cheerful tone. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." But inside, I was terrified. Not of seeing them, but of what they might notice. The day they arrived, the house was spotless, the smell of apple pie filling every corner. Robert greeted them at the door with the same warmth he always had. To them, we were the perfect couple, solid, unshakable, the example they wanted to follow. And I let them believe that. Because the truth was too ugly to share. That evening, after dinner, Michael hugged me and said, "Mom, I hope I can love someone as long as you and Dad have. You're lucky. Lucky." That word stung more than any insult could have. I smiled, holding back tears, and said softly, "Yes, sweetheart, I am." When they left, Robert sat quietly in his chair, staring at the old wedding photo on the wall. He sighed, a sound so heavy it almost broke me. Then he said something I'll never forget. "I used to look at that picture and see the best decision of my life. Now I'm not so sure." That was the moment something inside me hardened. Not out of anger, but out of survival. For 37 years, I had been his anchor, his caretaker, his calm in every storm. I had given up dreams, plans, even parts of myself to make his life easier. But now I realized I was the only one still holding on. The next morning, I went to the attic. I hadn't been up there in years, not since Michael left for college. Smelled of dust and forgotten summers. Boxes stacked neatly, filled with memories no one cared about anymore. I found an old tin box labeled letters. Inside were the ones we used to write when he worked in another city early in our marriage. Each line filled with love, longing, promises. But as I read through them, one caught my eye. It wasn't addressed to me. It was a name I didn't recognize, written in his handwriting. My heart sank. My hands trembled as I opened it. And in that moment I realized the man who said he wished he'd chosen someone else might have meant it more literally than I ever imagined. Paper was yellowed, edges curling with time. His handwriting was unmistakable, the same gentle loops that once traced "I love you" at the bottom of my birthday cards. But this letter, it wasn't for me. The name at the top was Eleanor. I'd never met an Eleanor in my life. My pulse slowed almost to a stop as I read the first line. I still think about you sometimes. About what could have been if I hadn't been so afraid. Every word was like a needle. He had written it years ago, before our son was born. Before the mortgage, before the gray in his hair, before we built this life together. Kept reading, my hands shaking. Ruth is kind. Good even. She deserves the best of me. But sometimes I wonder if I gave my heart to the wrong woman. That line, that single cruel line, split me in two. For a long moment I just sat there, staring at those words. The attic light flickered above me, dust swirling in the air like tiny ghosts of everything I thought I knew. He had loved someone else. And all these years he had carried her name quietly, tucked beneath his breath, like a secret he'd never planned to confess. I don't remember how long I sat there. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. But when I finally stood, I wasn't the same woman who had gone up those stairs. Something in me had cracked open. When I came downstairs, Robert was reading the newspaper, the same way he always did on Sundays. The sunlight fell across his face, soft, peaceful. He looked up, smiled, and asked, "You all right, Ruth?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw that letter on the table and demand answers. But instead, I nodded. Yes, I'm fine. Because after all these years, fine was all I knew how to be. That night, I cooked his favorite meal, meatloaf with mashed potatoes. He told me it was perfect, kissed my cheek, and went back to watching television. And I watched him, the man who once promised me forever, with quiet eyes that no longer saw him the same way. He had built a life with me, yes. But his heart had always belonged elsewhere. In the days that followed, I replayed our entire marriage in my head, every anniversary, every argument, every moment I had doubted myself. Was he thinking of her then? When he held my hand at the hospital? When he danced with me at Michael's wedding? When he whispered, "You're my everything," was I just a substitute for someone else? The thought consumed me. One morning, I found myself sitting in our bedroom, staring at the framed photo from our honeymoon. We looked so young. I remembered how he used to call me his beginning and his end. And now, I couldn't help but wonder if I had only ever been the middle. That's when I decided something quietly, something no one would notice, not at first. If he had spent our life wondering about what might have been, then I would spend the rest of mine discovering who I was without him. It didn't happen overnight. It started with little things. I stopped setting his clothes out in the morning, stopped waiting for him to ask what was for dinner, stopped answering every call of my name right away. And every time I said no, every time I chose silence over service, a small part of me began to heal. One evening, as he sat watching the evening news, I asked, "Robert, do you ever regret anything?" He didn't even look away from the screen. "Everyone does, Ruth." "Why?" I smiled softly. "Just wondering." Because the truth was, I had started regretting something too, all the years I spent loving a man who had already left me in his mind. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, listening to his steady breathing, I reached under my pillow and touched the old letter. Paper was soft from being folded too many times. And as my fingers brushed across his handwriting, I whispered something to myself. "I may not have been your first choice, Robert, but I'll be your last lesson." I didn't know then what those words would come to mean. But they stayed with me, like a seed, quiet and buried deep, waiting for the right moment to bloom. The days grew longer after that. I started going on walks by myself, through the park near the library where we used to take Michael as a boy. There was peace in being alone. The kind of peace I had never known inside our home. One afternoon, I saw an older couple sitting on a bench, holding hands. The man brushed a leaf out of the woman's hair, and she smiled like it was the first time he'd ever touched her. It hit me then, love like that never grows from comfort. Grows from choice. From choosing the same person every single day, even when it's hard. And Robert had stopped choosing me a long time ago. That night, I took out my old journal. The one I hadn't opened in years. And I started writing. Not about him, but about me. The girl I used to be. The woman I became. And the stranger who shared my bed. Every line felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had lost somewhere along the way. And then, the next morning, something unexpected happened. Robert came into the kitchen holding that same old tin box. He looked pale. Nervous almost. "Ruth," he said quietly, "I found something in the attic. A letter I wrote decades ago. I don't even remember why I kept it." He placed it on the counter between us. I looked at him for a long time. He had no idea I'd already read it. And that's when I realized the game had just changed. I stood in that kitchen, the morning light spilling through the window like a question I didn't want to answer. Robert's hand rested on the tin box between us. He looked uneasy, older somehow. The kind of old that doesn't come from years, but from guilt. He cleared his throat. "It was from before we married. A foolish letter, really. I didn't even send it." He gave a small laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You know how young men can be." I nodded, pretending to listen, though my mind was somewhere far away. I watched his lips move, forming words that tried to explain away decades of silence. But nothing he said could undo the ink of that letter. I just said softly, "I know, Robert. We all have our regrets." He looked relieved, maybe even grateful, that I hadn't made a scene. And that was the moment I realized how little he understood me. He thought my silence was forgiveness. But really, it was the sound of me waking up. That evening, after he went to bed, I sat at my desk by the window. Outside, the streetlight flickered on, and the crickets sang the same song they always did. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel small in my own house. I opened my journal again and began to write, this time not about the past, but about the truth I had spent my whole life avoiding. I wrote about the woman who learned to shrink herself so her husband could shine. About the mother who spent every birthday alone because someone always needed something. About the wife who kept forgiving not because she wanted to, but because she was afraid of what would happen if she stopped. The words poured out of me like water breaking through a dam. And somewhere between the lines, I found something I hadn't felt in years, my own voice. The next morning, I walked down to the post office. It wasn't far, just a few blocks from the bakery where I used to take Michael when he was little. I bought a small stack of stationery, the kind with delicate blue flowers on the corners. The clerk smiled at me, said, "Writing to someone special?" I smiled back. "In a way," I said. "Yes." What she didn't know was that the person I was finally writing to was myself. That afternoon, I began composing a letter. Not to Robert. Not yet. But to the woman I used to be. "Dear Ruth," I wrote, "I'm sorry. I should have protected you better. You gave your whole heart to a man who only gave you half of his. But it's not too late to find the missing pieces." It was a strange feeling, comforting myself like an old friend. But the more I wrote, the lighter I felt. Like I was finally letting go of something that had been pressing on my chest for years. Robert noticed the change, of course. He started watching me in small, uncertain ways, asking if I was all right. He didn't know what to make of the quiet peace that had replaced my old softness. But one night he said, "You've been distant lately." I looked at him over my cup of tea. "Maybe I'm just closer to myself." He frowned, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" I smiled. You'll understand someday. That's the thing about men like Robert. They mistake gentleness for weakness. They think silence means surrender. But silence can be sharp, sharper than any words. And I had learned to wield it well. In the weeks that followed, I started sorting through our things. Old photographs, birthday cards, anniversary gifts. For every memory that made me ache, I placed a small mark, a quiet reminder of what no longer held me. One night, I found a box of his old love letters to me, written before our wedding. They were beautiful, tender. But now, all I could see were the spaces between the lines, the places where truth should have lived. As I read, one letter fell from my hands and drifted under the dresser. When I reached down to get it, I found something I didn't expect. An envelope sealed, yellowed with age. My name written in his handwriting. But it wasn't from our early years. The date on it was March 2009. That was the year after his father died. I hesitated, staring at it for a long time before I finally opened it. Inside was a note, brief, barely half a page. Ruth, sometimes I think you deserve better than me. I've never been the man you believed I was. I hope someday you'll forgive me or at least forget me kindly. That was it. No explanation. No signature. Just those words. I sat there in the half-dark, the paper trembling in my hands. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was cowardice. But in that moment, I realized something powerful. He had always known what he'd done, and chosen to hide behind silence anyway. And that knowledge didn't break me. Freed me. I folded the letter, placed it back inside, and tucked it into my journal. For once, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman standing at the edge of her own life, finally deciding which way to turn. The next morning, I started a ritual. Every day, I'd sit at my desk for 1 hour and write, not for anyone else, not even for forgiveness, but for clarity. And with every page, I began building something. Something he wouldn't see coming. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was peace. But peace, I learned, often requires honesty. The kind of honesty that burns before it heals. And so, one quiet Sunday morning, I began a letter addressed to my husband. I didn't know it then, but that letter would change everything. It started as a single page. Just one sheet of paper and a trembling pen. But once I began writing, the words came like rain after a long drought. I didn't plan the letter, it simply happened. Maybe that's what honesty really is, the part of us that no longer needs permission to speak. Robert, I began. There was a time I believed that love meant staying no matter the cost. That loyalty meant silence. That forgiveness meant forgetting. But now I know it doesn't. The ink bled softly into the paper as I wrote. My hand shook at first, but then steadied. With each line, the weight in my chest grew lighter. You said you wished you'd chosen someone else. I've replayed those words more times than I should admit. But perhaps the truth is, I should have chosen someone else too, a version of myself who didn't depend on your love to feel alive. I paused there, letting the words breathe. Outside, the wind rustled the curtains. The afternoon light slipped across the floor, slow and golden. It was peaceful, painfully peaceful. I continued. You once told me I made this house a home. You were right. But what you never realized was how much of myself I poured into its walls. So much that when you stopped seeing me, I began fading too. I sat back, reading what I'd written. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like truth finally finding its voice after decades of silence. I folded the page neatly and placed it in a drawer. Not because I was finished, but because I wanted to let it rest. Sometimes the heart needs a night to decide what it truly wants to say. That night, Robert and I ate dinner together in silence. He spoke about his work at the garden club, about the new neighbors who'd moved in next door. And I smiled and nodded, pretending I was listening, but inside something strange was happening. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. He had his regrets. But I was done collecting mine. Later that evening, I returned to the drawer and opened the letter again. I began a new page. "Do you remember the lake house?" I wrote. "You proposed to me there, under the oak tree in the rain. You said you'd never stop choosing me. I used to believe that. For years, I'd close my eyes and see your face that night, the rain caught in your hair, the way your voice trembled. But now, when I think of it, I realize I was the only one who made that promise real." My pen hesitated, then continued. "You stopped choosing me long before you ever said the words. It happened quietly, in the way you stopped asking how I felt, stopped noticing the things I did, stopped hearing me when I spoke." I wrote until the clock struck midnight. Each line became lighter, cleaner, like my soul was leaving behind its own shadow. And then I wrote the words that would change the course of our life together. "I forgive you, Robert. But I also forgive myself for believing that love meant erasing who I was." When I read it back, I cried. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time in my life I had spoken my truth without fear of how it might sound. The next morning, I woke up before him. I brewed his coffee, placed it on the kitchen table, and next to it the first page of my letter. He came down half an hour later, still in his robe, his hair a gray mess of confusion. He picked up the paper, squinting as he read the first few lines. I watched quietly from the doorway. His lips trembled. His shoulders fell. He didn't say a word. He just folded the page and left it there. For the rest of the day, he barely spoke. And for once, I didn't chase after his silence. I had done that all my life, filled the quiet with apologies, patched over cracks that weren't mine to fix. Not anymore. Instead, I went for a walk. The sun was gentle, and the trees swayed like old friends waving me forward. I stopped by the little park where we used to take Michael as a child. The bench was still there, the same spot where I once sat with a newborn in my arms, dreaming of a life that now felt like someone else's story. I sat there for a long time, tracing the lines of my palms, wondering when exactly I had started to disappear. And then I smiled because now I was beginning to return. That evening, when I came home, Robert was waiting at the kitchen table again. Page lay in front of him, neatly folded, next to his cold coffee. He looked up, eyes red. "You wrote this?" he asked softly. "Yes," I said. "And there's more." His throat tightened. "Should I read it?" I shrugged lightly. "Only if you're ready to see me, really see me." He looked down at the page again but didn't open it. I could tell he didn't know what to do with my truth. Men like him never do. But that didn't matter anymore. The letter wasn't for him to understand. It was for me to release. That night, I added another line at the end. "If you ever find this complete, it means I've finally remembered who I am." I placed the pages together, folded them neatly, and tucked them inside the old photo album, the one labeled Our Beginning. 'Cause that's where my ending would belong. I didn't know when he would find it, or how it would make him feel. But I knew this much: it would be his turn to live with the silence. And that silence would teach him everything words never could. 4 days after that first letter, something changed between us. The air inside the house felt different, softer but heavier. He moved through it like a man haunted by echoes he couldn't name. And I began to see everything clearly for the first time in decades. Robert spoke less. But when he did, it wasn't about the weather or bills or the neighbor's dog. It was quieter things, almost hesitant. One evening he said, "You've been writing again." It wasn't a question, more like a realization. I looked up from my notebook. "Yes," he nodded, his eyes lingering on the pages scattered across the table. "You used to do that a lot, when we first married." "I remember," I said. What I didn't tell him was that back then I wrote to stay alive inside a life that kept shrinking around me. He stood there for a while, as if waiting for me to say something more. But I didn't. I had learned that silence can be its own kind of truth. That night I continued writing, not to him but for me. It wasn't a letter anymore. It was a confession, a map of my own rediscovery. You told me once, I wrote, that you loved me because I made life feel easy. I thought that was a compliment. But now I understand, easy love isn't always real love. Sometimes it's just comfortable silence. And I've lived in silence too long. I wrote about the early years, how we built dreams together, how laughter once filled every corner of our small home. I wrote about the years that followed, when love became routine and routine became distance. But I also wrote about the moments I still cherished. The smell of him after rain. The way he laughed when Michael took his first steps. The sound of his humming in the garage on Sunday afternoons. 'Cause truth, no matter how painful, deserves kindness too. When I finished that night, I didn't hide the pages. I left them on the desk, not as an invitation but as a choice. He could read them or not. Either way, I was no longer invisible. The next morning, I found him sitting there, reading. He didn't notice me at first. His hand trembled slightly, his lips moving silently over each line. When he finally looked up, I saw something I hadn't seen in him for years. Regret. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet one. Kind that eats at a man when he realizes he's run out of time to fix what he's broken. He stood, folded the papers gently, and said, "You make me sound like a stranger." I looked at him and said softly, "Maybe you became one while I wasn't looking." He swallowed hard. "I didn't mean what I said, Ruth." That day, I was angry. I was tired. I stopped him with a raised hand. "Robert, it's not about that one sentence. It's about the years that came before it. The years I spent waiting for you to notice I was still here." He had no reply. Only silence. That night, he slept in the bedroom. I stayed downstairs, surrounded by the pages of my life, letters, fragments, unfinished words. I began to gather them all into one, not just a goodbye, but a story. A story only he would ever read. Not to make him hurt, but to make him see. For the first time, I wasn't writing to be loved. I was writing to be remembered. Over the next week, I wrote everything I had never said. Every ache. Every small kindness. Every disappointment that turned into distance. Every hope that quietly faded into routine. And yet, between those lines, something else emerged, forgiveness. Because you can't carry pain forever. At some point, you either let it bury you or you set it down and walk away lighter. One morning, Robert found me in the garden. He stood behind me, watching as I trimmed the roses. "Are you leaving me?" he asked suddenly. I didn't look at him. I kept pruning the thorns. "I already did," I said quietly. "You just didn't notice." He turned away, his shoulders heavy, his silence deeper than ever before. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to reach for him. I had reached enough. That evening, I placed the completed letter, now nearly 20 pages long, inside an envelope. I sealed it with wax, the way I used to seal letters when we were young. On the front, I wrote just one word, "Read." I tucked it into the drawer of his nightstand. Not hidden. Just waiting. 'Cause some truths aren't meant to be spoken. They're meant to be found. And when he did, I wanted him to see not just what I'd written, but what I'd become. I didn't tell anyone where I went. Not my son, not my sister, not even my closest neighbor. I simply disappeared. There was something peaceful about silence after years of noise. The kind of noise that lives in the heart, arguments echoing long after the room falls quiet. I drove until I reached the sea, a small cottage my parents once owned, untouched since they passed. The windows were dusty, the walls smelled of salt and thyme, but it felt more like home than the house I had lived in for 37 years. That night, I sat on the porch, listening to the ocean breathe. Every wave sounded like a confession. And in that rhythm, I felt something shift, not anger, not sadness. Just release. I thought of Robert, of the way his face twisted that morning when he said he wished he'd chosen someone else. The words that split me open left me hollow. I wondered if he regretted saying them. I wondered if he even noticed I was gone. But that's the strange thing about people who take you for granted. They don't notice your absence until your silence becomes louder than your voice. Back in the house we shared, I imagined the quiet started to feel heavy. He must have walked into the kitchen that next morning expecting to find coffee brewing, sunlight on the counter, the familiar hum of a life built together. But instead, only absence. He found my note on the table. It wasn't long. I didn't want it to be. Robert, after 37 years, I've finally understood what love isn't. It isn't a promise spoken in youth. It isn't sacrifice without gratitude. It isn't choosing comfort over kindness. You said you wished you'd chosen someone else, and now so do I. I wish I'd chosen myself sooner. I imagine him standing there, rereading those lines, trying to decide if it was anger or truth speaking. But I didn't write it to wound him. I wrote it so I could breathe again. For days I stayed near the ocean, waking to gulls and the sound of the tide kissing the shore. I began cooking for one, small breakfasts, simple meals. Every little act felt sacred. Freedom has a strange taste when you've starved for it so long. But what I didn't know was that my absence had started to unravel something inside him. Robert searched. First, I believe it was pride. He wanted to find me, to scold me for leaving, to prove I couldn't live without him. But the days turned to weeks, and when he found the envelope I'd hidden inside his dresser, the one marked, "Read this when you remember who I was," something changed. That letter wasn't angry either. It was a story of us, of who we were before bitterness took root. I wrote about the nights we danced barefoot in the kitchen, the promises we made when money was tight, and how I used to trace the lines of his palm while we planned the life we now lived separately. I ended it with a question. When did love become something you survived instead of something you gave? Later, my sister called. She said Robert had been visiting places from our past, the park where we met, the diner where he proposed, even my parents' old house. He looked lost, she said. Like a man who misplaced his own heart. I didn't know how to feel. I dreamed of that moment, him realizing my worth, but when it finally came, it didn't taste like victory. Tasted like melancholy. 'Cause love, once broken, doesn't rebuild the same way. Till part of me wanted him to find peace, the same peace I was learning to build alone. One evening, as the sun set low and painted the waves copper, I found a small box I'd packed without thinking. Inside it were photographs, our wedding, birthdays, the house we built from scratch. The faces in those pictures were strangers to me now, but there was something sacred about keeping proof that we once existed, that at one point love was enough. That's when I made my decision. I wasn't going back, not to the house, not to the hurt. But I could still leave him one last piece of closure. So I wrote again. Not a letter this time. A story. Our story, the way I remembered it, not how it ended. I told him about the woman who waited for years for her husband to see her again, and the man who finally realized too late that love unspoken still fades. I ended it simply. You once told me that home was wherever I was. Now I know home is peace. I hope you find yours, Robert. I already found mine. I mailed it with no return address. And for the first time in decades, I slept soundly. But a week later, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived for me. The handwriting was shaky, familiar, and broken. Robert had found me. The envelope was thin. The kind that trembles in your hand before you even open it, as if it already carries a ghost. My name was written in that same uneven way he always wrote it, too large, slightly tilted, as though his heart moved faster than his pen. For a moment I just held it. The sea breeze brushed across my cheek, and I thought maybe I shouldn't read it. Maybe some words are better left unsaid. But then again, after 37 years together, I had learned that silence can be the cruelest kind of goodbye. I sat by the window, the same window where I had watched countless sunsets fade into the horizon. With careful fingers, I opened the letter. The paper smelled faintly of the house I'd left, of pine wood, old books, and memories I'd buried. His handwriting stumbled across the page, but the words were steady. Ruth, I don't know where to begin or how to make sense of what I feel. When I told you I wished I'd chosen someone else, I thought I was being honest. Now I see I was being cruel. You see, I wasn't wishing for another woman. I was wishing for another version of myself, one that hadn't turned bitter, one that hadn't forgotten how to love you right. I stopped reading. My hands trembled. For a second, I could almost hear his voice again, that deep, weary tone that had carried both comfort and disappointment for so long. He continued, I walked through the house after you left, and it felt like walking through my own grave. Every room held your absence, the scent of your cooking, the sound of your laughter in the walls. I realized then that I'd mistaken your patience for weakness, your silence for indifference. But now, in this silence, I hear everything I never listened to. Tears welled up before I could stop them. I wasn't sure if I was crying for him or for the years we lost. I went to the diner last night, the same one where I proposed to you. The waitress didn't recognize me. She wasn't even born when we sat there that night, holding hands over burnt coffee and cheap pie. But sitting in that booth, I saw it, the life we built and the way I slowly chipped away at it. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, Ruth. I don't know if I deserve it. But if you ever think of me as the man who finally remembered who you were. The woman who built everything I once took for granted. The letter ended there. No signature. Just a smudge of ink, as if a tear had fallen where his name should have been. I folded the page slowly, pressing it against my chest. There was a quiet ache inside me, but it wasn't pain anymore. It was something softer, sorrow touched with understanding. All my life, I'd waited for Robert to see me, really see me. And now that he finally had, it came too late to fix what time had already broken. But still, it meant something. It meant that I hadn't imagined the love we once had. It meant that the woman I used to be had mattered. For days, I carried that letter with me everywhere, in my apron pocket, beside my bed, tucked into the pages of the book I was reading. I'd take it out at night and read it again, tracing the words with my fingertips. Not because I longed for him, but because they reminded me of something I'd forgotten, my own worth. But one evening, as I sat by the shore watching the sun bleed into the water, I realized something. Forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me. Because holding on to anger keeps you tied to the pain, but forgiveness, it sets you free to live again. I decided to write back. Not a long letter, just enough to let him know I'd hurt him, that I'd understood. Robert, you don't need to ask for forgiveness. You already gave me what I needed, the truth. That's all I ever wanted from you. I wish you peace, truly. But I found mine, and I think we both know it's time to let each other go, this time for good. I mailed it the next morning, sealing it with the same calm certainty that had once taken me years to find. I didn't know what he'd feel when he read it. Relief? Regret? Maybe both. But I knew this much. I wasn't waiting for a reply. That chapter of my life had closed. And yet, a week later, life decided to surprise me one more time. 'Cause one morning, as I walked to the edge of the beach, I saw a man standing near the rocks, shoulders stooped, hat in hand, watching the sea as though he was waiting for someone. Even from a distance, I knew it was him. I froze where I stood. The wind carried the scent of salt and old memories, and for a moment I felt as though time itself had paused, just to let us exist in the same silence again. Robert turned slowly. His eyes, though dimmer, still carried that same blue-gray hue I once fell in love with. But this time there was no pride left in them. Only weariness and something else. Regret. He looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just grown larger, not in body but in spirit. He walked toward me, every step hesitant, as if afraid the ground between us might break. When he stopped just a few feet away, he opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Only the sound of the waves filled the gap between us. Finally, I broke the silence. "I got your letter," I said softly. He nodded. His voice cracked when he replied, "And I got yours." There was a long pause. Not awkward, just heavy, like the weight of every unsaid thing between two people who once shared a life. "I didn't expect to see you here," I said. "I didn't plan to come," he admitted. "I just couldn't stay away." I studied him for a long moment. His hands trembled slightly. He wasn't wearing his wedding ring anymore. "I read your letter every night," he continued. "Not because I wanted to hold on, but because it reminded me of who I used to be, the man you deserved." Something in me softened. The anger I once carried had long since faded, replaced by a kind of peace I hadn't known was possible. I looked out at the horizon. "You know, Robert, I used to wait for the day you'd tell me you loved me again." Then I realized I didn't need to hear it. I just needed to love myself enough to stop waiting. He lowered his gaze. "You were always stronger than me, Ruth." For a while we said nothing. The ocean spoke for us, soft waves lapping at the shore, the gulls crying overhead, the world moving forward as if to remind us that life doesn't stop for anyone. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, folded, worn, fragile. It was a photograph. Us on our wedding day. My veil fluttering in the wind. His arm around my waist. Two people smiling like the world was theirs. "I found this behind your dresser," he said. "I think it wanted to be found." I took it from his hands carefully. The edges were faded, the colors nearly gone, but our faces, our younger selves, still glowed with something pure. I smiled faintly. "That was before we learned how hard love can be." He nodded. "And before I learned that pride can destroy what love builds." We stood there together, not as husband and wife, but as two old souls who had finally made peace with their mistakes. "Do you hate me?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "No, Robert. I don't hate you. I think I just stopped waiting for you to change. And somewhere in that stillness, I learned how to forgive you and myself." He looked at me then, eyes glistening. "You always had the kindest heart." I smiled sadly. "No, Robert. I just had too much love to waste." The tide reached our feet. For a brief second, his hand brushed against mine, not to hold it but to say goodbye. "And that was enough," he whispered. "I hope you're happy." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the boy I married, the man I loved, and the stranger I'd let go. "I am," I said, "for the first time in a long while." And then he nodded, turned, and walked away, slowly, like someone learning how to carry an old wound without letting it define them. I watched him disappear down the shoreline until he became just another shadow against the sea. Then I looked up at the sky, soft streaks of orange melting into blue, and I realized something. Forgiveness doesn't mean erasing the past. It means remembering it without bleeding. I walked back to my cottage, the sand cool beneath my bare feet. On the kitchen table, I placed the photograph beside the seashell I'd kept since our honeymoon, a reminder that even broken things can still be beautiful if you hold them gently enough. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, Robert, for teaching me how to love and how to let go." The stars shimmered faintly, as if they'd heard me. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel lonely. I felt whole. 'Cause peace isn't found in the people who leave us. It's found when we finally learn to stay with ourselves. That night, as I watched the waves rise and fall, I realized love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means walking away and finding yourself waiting on the other side. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks, so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.